Hello, everyone. I was hoping to use this lecture just to give you a quick introduction to some of the key themes and ideas and questions around Victorianism and the new imperialism. These are some of the major ideas that are dominating European society, particularly British society, in the late 19th century. And The Sign of Four, which you were going to read for Thursday, is a really interesting take on these issues. It is a Sherlock Holmes novel, but it also covers a lot of these questions. What do British people think, or what does Sir Arthur Conan Doyle think about Victorian society and about British imperialism in the late 19th century? And the reason I'm giving this lecture is because a lot of times students will write response papers that suggest that Conan Doyle is reflecting the key ideas that we all think we know. We all know that Victorians are prudes and that they are racists and all of the rest. Maybe they are right, but maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. So the goal of today is not to completely overturn what we think of when we think of Victorianism or imperialism, but to point out that these issues really are up for debate when Conan Doyle is writing. It really is an open question. What does he himself think about them? So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction. You can follow along with the slides if you would like, and hopefully you'll get the key points that I was trying to get out here. So on the Victorian morality side of things first, there is this idea that the late 19th century, in England in particular, is a return to a sort of traditionalism. We have this wonderful slide here of Queen Victoria and her husband. You notice how they are dressed. They do not look like our stereotypical monarchs dressed to the nines in royal robes and all of the rest. Instead, they look like a banker and his wife, or a merchant and his wife. They're trying to be the ideal, proper married couple. So part of the idea of the Victorian mode of life is a return to sort of more traditional family values after some of the wildness that maybe we've seen in the early 19th century. And by the same token, the politics in Parliament often reflect that. The interesting thing that you look at is when you look at control of Parliament, Parliament does shift back and forth from one political party to another. But what's amazing is that the leaders stay remarkably consistent. We have only 3 different men who are prime minister over a course of 40 years. So in other words, there are many, many things that they are generally agreeing on. And certainly control will shift back and forth. But for the most part, there's no sense of dramatic upheaval. There are a lot of ideas where the Victorian consensus persists. And so in that vein, a lot of times when we say Victorian, these are sort of the images that come to our head. We have proper queens, we have proper politicians, we have very strict ideas about what constitutes proper behavior in public life or in private life. And there's a great example of this that a lot of people cite when they talk about Victorian morality. For the first time, we are seeing the proliferation of books about manners, books about proper modes of behavior. Okay, so historians will point to these and say, well, obviously, this is the Victorians. They even believe that they need to tell people how to behave. This is true, but think about books about manners today. Our books about manners today don't tell anyone not to spit on the floor. The reason that they don't do that is because everybody knows that you don't spit on the floor. So by the same token, the things that books about manners and books about conduct actually do talk about suggest that they are actually in dispute, that the readers would actually need to be corrected on these sorts of things. So because there is this proliferation of these manners books, books about high society, and all of the rest, there is a sense that that these books suggest a particularly aggressive morality, but in practice, it suggests that they are, in fact, contested. These values that they are trying to espouse have not been completely absorbed by the population. And I cut back on some of the reading for this particular lecture, but if you go back and you look at the excerpts in the Perry Source Reader about Victorian life, this is the theme that really persists. We have these social critics who are pointing out that actually things are not quite as good as the predominant morality would suggest. And these critical voices become more and more prominent over the course of the century. So I have just a few slides if you want to look at those, the sorts of things that people are complaining about. The environmental effects of industrial London. It's absolutely miserable to work in these factories and to breathe that air. And the tremendous, tremendous poverty that many of the industrial class are driven to. We have our excerpt about specifically those who are driven into prostitution. So that's my big sort of argument about Victorianism. we should think about the ways that a book like The Sign of Four maybe reflects the manners and the morals of the time, maybe suggests this is proper or that is proper. But we also need to keep in mind the possibility that Conan Doyle is also trying to critique a lot of these ideals as well. And that same sort of thinking applies when we talk about imperialism, which is a much bigger topic in the narrative. Materialism or imperialism is actually a great way of thinking through some of these materialist and idealistic narratives about how history moves forward. So, in the course of the 19th century, we get a sort of revived emphasis on imperialism and imperial projects. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First off, the old imperial projects are sort of falling apart. During the late 18th century and into the 19th century with the Napoleonic Wars, we see a wave of revolutions all across the New World. So the American colonies against England, we have revolutions against, or slave revolts against French rule in Haiti. We have rebellions against the Portuguese and Spanish rule in South America. So for a lot of European powers, the old imperialism, the imperialism of North and South America, is now done away with. So instead, they turn their attention to other areas. And you can see a couple of maps here that give a sense of where that shift is. We see expanded British rule in India. We see competition in South East Asia. We see, it doesn't quite show up on this map, but we see sort of imperialism in all but name in China and in Japan, because mostly the British, but other Western forces as well, use military might to penetrate into these areas with trade networks to get guaranteed rights for their merchants and so on and so forth. So that's one big area where we see the new imperialism of the 19th century. But the other big area where we see it, and where it becomes a big sort of imperial project, is Africa. So you see tremendous attention to explorers like David Livingstone, this amazing missionary, explorer, adventurer, anti-slavery advocate, and all of the rest. He becomes a tremendously popular figure. But the interesting thing about this new imperialism is the way that it proceeds. It's very different compared to the imperialism of prior eras. In prior eras, the exploration of the New World led to all sorts of conflict between the European powers. But in fact, in the 19th century, imperialism proceeds much more peacefully, at least between the major powers. They're certainly doing all sorts of awful things on the ground, but as of yet, it doesn't cause war between the major powers. So they sign an accord that they are going to have their imperial project proceed relatively peacefully. One cannot just claim ground. One needs a presence in the territory. One needs a signed agreement with the local leaders. At least in theory, it is all nice and legal. In practice, of course, it doesn't look anything like that, but that's at least the theory of how they are working. Okay.